explore the dynamics of financialization, the linkage of financialization and digitalization, and how financialization influences public health systems. In the third session, we discuss the link between how this push to financialization and digitalization is linked to inequities in health. And in today's session, the plan is to discuss how we as a society can reclaim healthcare and our role as healthcare providers and thinkers in transforming a complex healthcare system. Over to you, Abhi.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gayatri. And good to see everybody today after even one day after Diwali or a few days after Diwali. So, yeah, today's session is deliberately quite different from the previous three sessions. The previous three sessions were much more analytical and basically trying to analyze the situation at multiple levels. And in some ways, it was a somewhat overwhelming also, perhaps, even for me. And when you look at the problem actually in its entirety, it sometimes becomes somewhat daunting. And therefore, I decided that in this session, we should take a little different track. And I think almost all the people joining these sessions are not just thinkers, they're also doers. They're people who want to work for change, who are already working for change in different ways on different fronts. And so the whole purpose of this entire exercise is to actually better inform our capacities and our our directions for working to change this entire situation. So I'll just start the slideshow again. Okay. So I hope this is visible now.
Visible.
Okay. So I'll start with and I have deliberately called this "How Can Society Reclaim Healthcare?" Because if you remember right in the first session and even in later sessions, I talked about the healthcare ecosystem. And it's not just the system. It's not just the set of doctors, hospitals, medicines, public and private healthcare sectors, but there's also something broader. And the entire, the forces of finance capital at the global level, which also heavily influence the national level, they're one part of the ecosystem. But another part of the ecosystem, which is not necessarily considered part of the healthcare system itself, is society. And the big countervailing power, the only probably force which can deal with financialization is society, or in an organized form. So let's see how we can think about this. Now, from the first three presentations, some of us might have felt that this is a bit pessimistic, and I'm here quoting Gramsci with a little modification. Actually, Gramsci had said that I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but an optimist because of will, but I have modified that to being a realist. And I think this is a kind of a fair way for an intellectual to deal with these situations and the kind of situation that we're working in today, because we have to be extremely realistic, obviously. We have to understand exactly what is going on in the strength, the size, the nature of financialization and so many associated economic and social forces and processes. But that doesn't mean that we become pessimistic, because this can be counterbalanced by an optimism of the will. And I think that's the kind of approach that I will try to adopt. And here's another well-known quote, which some of you must have come across, and which says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So change, and large-scale change or fundamental change or major changes take a lot of time, and they often may not be, it may not be apparent also if you take a short-term view that, such change is possible. But ultimately, changes do take place, and I will be giving several examples today to sort of strengthen my sort of appeal or argument about how in the current situation, these kind of the kind of transformations. First of all, what kind of transformations are we looking at, and how can they perhaps be broadly thought about at a very general level today? So let's recapitulate the trajectory of the Indian healthcare system, which already we have talked about a little bit in the previous sessions, but I'm just recapitulating, because unless we take a look at the past, we cannot imagine the future. And since independence in the last 75 years or so, when we got independence at that time, whatever existed in the name of healthcare in India was basically individual private practitioners, some not for profit or charitable or family run kind of institutions, and some sort of a rudimentary public health system. And whatever existed at that time was socially embedded. It was socially embedded healthcare. And its primary goal was fulfilling people's health needs in whatever form. It was not adequate. It was probably quite, underdeveloped or even primitive in certain ways. But whatever it was socially embedded. And this is something that we need to keep in mind in any civilized society across the world. The healthy take care of the sick. This is a fundamental human principle. And this is what informs healthcare systems. That is why healthcare is not just an individual responsibility, it's a social and mutual responsibility also. So from this social embeddedness of healthcare in our country, which was in previous periods also based on traditional practitioners, uh, and various kinds of other socially embedded healthcare. This is what we had in the 19 up till the 1970s and early 1980s. And after this, then from the 1980s onwards, the transformations started, which we have already discussed. And the first wave was basically with large numbers of specialist doctors being churned out, actually mostly by, at that time, earlier public medical colleges and then more and more private medical colleges. They started setting up their own nursing homes, their small and medium private hospitals, and healthcare started becoming more and more of a marketized commodity. The 1980s, the 1990s, this saw this transition across India in different forms. And then, of course, what we have already discussed in some detail is from the roughly 2000s onwards, healthcare becomes more and more of a capital intensive industry. So now the primary goal is profit making. It's very explicit. It's declared. And sort of a side effect is giving care to people. So from a socially embedded enterprise or a set of actors who are trying to basically serve people's health needs in the immediate post-independence period to today, a complete sort of significant change we have seen. And this is essentially the trajectory of commercialization and corporatization of healthcare, which is of course linked with financialization at the global level. So now this is the one part of history, but history doesn't end here. And as far as we know, there is, it's not an end of history. Uh, and if we look back over the last roughly 1.5 centuries, or maybe a little more than that, we will see that something quite, interesting has been happening, in which context we need to see now how we look at our own healthcare systems and how it might be uh, transformed. So today we have what is largely socially detached or predatory healthcare with corporate hospitals and so on, which we've already discussed. Now, these are increasingly, while they're more and more technically sophisticated, they're also more and more socially detached. And if you remember 20 years back or 30 years back, even the private practitioners, even the small and medium-sized private hospitals, which used to operate in certain neighborhoods or certain parts of a city, they had a certain kind of goodwill. And people used to go to a doctor because he or she had a reputation. And that reputation is part of the social goodwill, which, the medical professional has traditionally enjoyed in probably any society. But now, with socially detached and predatory healthcare, trust is disappearing and it's being replaced by branding. So now you're not supposed to actually approach a particular doctor whom you have trust in. You're supposed to approach a brand of a hospital like Apollo or Fortis or Max or Narayana or whatever. And this breakdown of trust is leading to all kinds of problems, as we've already discussed. And the doctor-patient relationship itself is being more and made, it's already been made to a large extent, very contractualized. And instead of, patients being referred through their own family doctor and so on, it's now unethical kinds of cuts, commissions, and so on, which are largely shaping the way in which patients are referred. And the traditional doctor-centered hierarchy, which is not necessarily always a very equitable uh, inclusive, but whatever it was, there used to be some sort of stability of employment within the family-owned hospital or the doctor-run hospital. Now the corporate style of extractive management has actually displaced even the frontline doctors from, their whatever position they had. And it's now a completely hire and fire kind of approach. And the earlier notions of state regulation, whatever diluted uh, and partially implemented they were, now has been replaced by a complete worship of the market and rejection of the need for regulation itself. So now we are faced with these options: socially embedded healthcare or socially detached and predatory healthcare. And at the same time, we cannot turn the clock back. We cannot go to the good old 1950s and 60s and 70s. It's neither possible and nor probably desirable, because uh, we are faced with a kind of a situation where we want modern technology, we want the entire range of benefits which are brought by modern medicine, but we don't want probably uh, the exploitative, extractive, and irrational aspects of corporatized healthcare, which we are all aware of. So therefore, we now need to see how we chalk a way forward. Um, and one thing which probably needs to be emphasized is the word health care contains the word care. And this is a question which we should start asking. Corporate hospitals claim to provide healthcare, but do they actually care for patients? I mean, the word care has a certain connotation. It has certain wider meaning. And probably, um, if you cannot pay, they don't care for you at all. If you pay, then they have some limited version of care. But even that, we know that probably at the heart of it, they don't care. So I'll now move ahead and come to a very uh, insightful theoretician who wrote in the 1940s and 50s um, about the great transformation in society. And his name was Karl Polanyi. Some of you may have heard about him or maybe even read about him. Probably under um, appreciated, in my opinion. And he was neither a hardcore communist nor he was definitely not a pro-capitalist sort of perspective. But he talked about the transformations which have been underway in society under capitalism, especially over the last 100 years or so when he was writing. And he said the social history of our time is the result of a double movement. So there are two kinds of movements which are constantly underway in society. At sometimes one kind of movement is dominant and the other is weak, and sometimes the other second movement is stronger. And the first movement is the basically linked with economic liberalism, establishment of what is called a self-regulating market, which is essentially an unregulated market, and which pushes a certain kind of model of economics, um, which we are seeing, of course, the result of that today. But there's also another movement, which is the principle of social protection, which aims at conservation of human beings and nature. And this second movement has always been there under capitalism, and in various forms it has been organized, and it has led to large scale major impacts, and which is something which we need to appreciate. So what are these first and second movements? I think this is very relevant when we start talking about how to socially reclaim healthcare. This is actually at the heart of the argument that I'll be making today. So what Polanyi basically said is that under capitalism, there is an expansion of unregulated markets. There is more and more exploitation. There are human impacts. There are inequalities. There are environmental negative impacts, and all this, it goes on up to a certain time, up to a certain level, and then it triggers some social reactions, and society moves to protect itself. And when we're talking about society, we're talking about the great mass of people. We are not talking about the small elite, which benefits from that situation, but the vast majority of society. It works to, protect itself from these impacts. So the first movement, which is the expansion of the market economy, this seeks to disembed the economy from society. So it says that we don't need any kind of regulation. We don't need, we want a free market. The free market is actually, it means it is free from social obligations of any kind. It's free from any kind of social regulations. And that's the kind of entire logic. But this disembedding of the economy from society, especially regarding certain aspects of the economy, when this goes beyond a certain point, it causes a lot of disruptions. And in fact, Polanyi talked about three entities, which is land, labor, and money, which he said that they are called commodities, but they cannot be treated as commodities. How can you treat land or labor, which is basically produced by human beings, as commodities? Things don't work that way. They're not produced as commodities, or they do not originate as commodities. But capitalism tries to convert these into commodities, and that leads to a whole range of problems. So I would like to add that just like land and labor are what Polanyi called fictitious commodities, uh, healthcare is a contentious commodity under capitalism. So capitalism would like to make this entirely a commodity, but there are a whole range of social factors, processes, and considerations because of which it doesn't sit comfortably as a pure commodity in society. So therefore, the second movement is a society's natural reaction to protect itself against the first movement. And this consists of various social, political, and institutional responses which seek to re-embed the economy within the social fabric. Because no economy can thrive beyond a certain point if it neglects society, or if its social impacts are so negative that they start leading to social disruptions. And these social movements take the form of various kinds of social processes, including welfare policies, labor rights, regulations in healthcare and education, and other state interventions. Uh, so let's see some examples of second movements, because this is not just an abstract process. It's actually something very, very concrete and of great relevance for everybody who works in public health, I think. So the rise of modern public health itself was actually a second movement, a kind of Polanyian second movement against the negative impacts of unrestrained capitalism in Europe in the mid-19th century. And the sanitary revolution, which we all read about in the history of public health, and which took different forms, but mainly arose in Western Europe, was actually a rise. It was a kind of a second movement where pe people realized that, yeah, is somebody saying something?
No, I think somebody's unmuted by mistake. I'll
Okay, please mute them. Yeah. Praveen, I think Praveen's mic is on. Can you just ask Praveen to mute? Okay. So basically, and similarly, the rise of trade unions, the entire rise of the labor movement and the socialist movement, even Bismarck's social insurance programs. So we talk about the health insurance, which was introduced in late 19th century Germany under Bismarck, was by no means a progressive or not necessarily a very, socially, in that sense, oriented towards social equity. But even under capitalism, it's realized that, certain kinds of social protection are important, including accident insurance, old age pensions. And then a major example of the second movement in recent history is the rise of post-World War II welfare states in Europe, and the formation of the NHS itself, which re-embedded the economy within society and said that healthcare needs to be basically available to entire society and decommodified in a certain fundamental way. And of course, I think Mike and others will add to this. But if we come now to countries like India, which are basically post-colonial states, here we see in 1948, this is actually exactly the same year when the NHS was launched, we see the ESI being launched. And an extremely interesting program, which has great, historical potential. Um, was also a form of a similar sort of second movement after the ravages of colonialism and the Second World War. Somewhere it was believed that everybody should have access to social security and healthcare. And incidentally, ESI was launched with a vision that it will progressively be generalized to the entire society. It's not just for workers. Of course, it started as a program for workers, but it was supposed to be expanded to cover the entire society. So that's actually the kind of vision which was there. Then the public distribution system, which was developed in India in the 1960s and 70s to protect people against the ravages of all kinds of market. So market failure, which is basically an inevitable consequence of the first movement to protect itself against market failure, society develops these various kinds of social mechanisms. And even more recently, MG Narega, Right to Education, Food Security Act, these are all different forms of second movements which we have seen in our own country. So these are not something distant or unrealistic. They continuously, it's a kind of a cycle probably. So there are phases when commercialization and unrestricted, unfettered market expansion take place. And then there are phases when the second movement comes into action and pushes back based on society's responses. And I would say the most recent and quite striking forms of second movement were seen during COVID, although we probably don't view them in that form. So if we just giving a couple of examples. So during COVID, across India and particularly in Maharashtra, but also in several other states, governments which had not regulated private healthcare effectively at all since decades, they suddenly came in and said, okay, now rates for COVID treatment need to be regulated. And in Maharashtra, actually 80% of the private hospital beds were supposed to be regulated for their prices. And so 15 states across India, which is like probably majority of Indian states, they tried to implement some kind of what I call interventionist regulation of private healthcare. Because in some cases, beds were taken over by the government. In some cases, the health insurance schemes were expanded to be cover the entire population, which is like what happened in Maharashtra. And various other such measures were also done. Or the admissions on private hospital beds were getting publicly managed. So these are forms of interventionist regulation, which were kind of almost inconceivable before COVID. So of course, you can say that this is an emergency situation. It was an exceptional situation. Of course, that is true. But it shows that the state, and this is the kind of second movement because market failure was looming so large and it was moving towards a market disaster. People would have started dying on the streets if the private hospitals, or they would have been so, terribly, impoverished and ravaged financially that the state had to step in with this kind of interventionist regulation. So this was a small example of a social movement in very recent period. And then the way in which the social accountability of private hospitals is emerged as a demand in Maharashtra. And of course, I have already shared with many of you, so I'm not repeating all those details. But the point is that there were anger assemblies which are organized by ordinary women who had lost their husbands to COVID. There was a large-scale social response, a lot of support from the media, and even the then ruling party and the ruling government had to take cognizance of this entire situation. And based on Jan Arogya Abhiyan's demands, they had to order a participatory audit of overcharging by private hospitals, and which, as you probably know, resulted in quite unique refunds by private hospitals of 25,000, 50,000, 1 lakh rupees to patients who had been overcharged during the related to COVID treatment. So my point is that uh, this is a kind of a small second movement which we saw even during COVID, when society pushed back against completely unregulated market dynamics of the private healthcare sector. So let us, not forget these important experiences over history and also in recent history when we get a little depressed by looking at the first movement. So, of course, the first movement leads to the economy being detached from society and social disembedding of healthcare. Now, this is the crux of what we're talking about today. So, today, corporatized healthcare, particularly, is increasingly detached from society and completely integrated into the globalized financialized capitalist economy. It's becoming more and more like any other industry. But healthcare cannot be treated that way for very long. And one reason for this is also because society, as we understand it, is also largely fragmented and often disempowered. And that enables, this kind of a capture of the healthcare sector by the economy, the financialized economy.
Abhay,
What
I'm
is,
sorry to
uh,
interrupt you. I'm so
yeah,
sorry.
uh,
If you can just make me co-host, there may be people
oh,
trying to enter. Uh, I
I'm sorry.
That's fine.
I thought you were already a host. Aren't you a host?
Yeah, I was. Then I don't know.
Uh,
Something has happened. If you can just make me co-host,
oh,
then I.
okay. Just a minute. Now, how do I do that? I think I'll have to stop sharing. Okay. I assume that you are the host and I am the co-host. Just a second. Okay, I have made you the co-host.
Yeah, that's
Can,
fine.
can you
Thank you.
see that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we'll resume. So basically, the second movement, which is in reaction to the, you know, adverse impacts of commercialization, this is basically now what we need to carefully think about. And this involves socially re-embedding healthcare through public action. And public action involves a whole range of public actors. It's not just by the government. It's not just by civil society organizations. It's not just by elected representatives. It's not just by the bureaucracy. It involves a range of public actors, which I'll come to soon. And basically, the direction is decommodification and social regulation of healthcare. So instead of this capture of the healthcare sector by the capitalist, the financialized economy, it's basically a process of socially reclaiming healthcare. This is essentially the direction of second movement that we need to think about. And given the entire history, both more distant history and also more recent history, this kind of a second movement is probably already incipient in the Indian situation. And we saw one small example of that during COVID. But obviously, this needs to be now developed on a much larger scale. And my sort of hunch is that once you have a new idea, which is an important idea, even if the situation changes, your mind does not go back to the uh, you know, um, earlier understanding or limited understanding. So our experiences during COVID also of large scale different kinds of social solidarity, which more or less spontaneously emerged in so many parts of the country. So many people volunteered in different forms. They opened, COVID care centers. They fed their neighbors. They fed people who are complete strangers who had come from outside their areas. Supported migrant workers, and so many things happened. So that shows us that Indian society is not dead; it's only dormant, or solidarity, as we understand it. And I think this is a very important lesson, which perhaps we have not discussed enough about what exactly, what are the positive things that happened during COVID. We have a lot of experience, of course, about the huge range of negative things that happened. But there are some significant lessons that we probably, and these are most important probably for people working in the healthcare sector. They're of course important for every sector. So let's see what are some of these lessons. They are tough lessons because of course they came at a huge cost. But even if we have borne the cost of COVID, let's not lose sight of these somewhat painfully learned lessons. So the one important lesson is that social solidarity is dormant in society. And in times of commercialization, it may appear to have become very weak or sort of non-existent. But look across the country in so many places, especially in rural areas, but even in urban areas, people, the kind of spontaneous collectivity which we have seen, which emerged in a very negative situation, can it be retapped into to develop a much more positive kind of process? And then this is a very other important point. When we talk about public institutions, public agency, we usually refer to the government, and which is of course not incorrect. But during COVID, we saw in so many cases that a much wider range of public actors got activated to deal with the COVID pandemic. So community groups, volunteers, frontline health workers, panchayat members, and many other such groups, they all are part of the public as we understand it. So this is the expanded public. This is the expanded understanding of public that we now need to develop when we start talking about public health and reclaiming, um, health for society. So this expanded public is very much there. It needs to be organized. It needs to be consolidated around a common program. So in COVID, the common program was very clear, relatively. Uh, People had to be saved. They had to be given various kinds of services and protection. So now if we have a positive common program, the same or some similar expanded public could be activated. Uh, Another thing which we saw is this mobilization of medical victims. So many people, including lots of middle class people, very sharply realized the kind of exploitation, the kind of overcharging, the kind of denial of care which they faced in private hospitals. And also, the fact that the way in which corporate hospitals behave, not all hospitals did the same thing. There were also not genuinely not-for-profit providers who try to support people in their own respective areas, and like mission hospitals and others, even more socially embedded smaller providers. So there is a spectrum within the healthcare system also, which becomes obvious. And then there are lots of non-market systems. This is again something which we tend to forget when we get overwhelmed by the market. But COVID showed us that there's so many kinds of non-market systems which came into play. Households, most importantly, communities, also in so you are not feeding people because you expected to get money out of it. You're just feeding people because it was the thing to do. It was a completely non-market mechanism. It's part of what is there in any society: mutual support and reciprocal support. If I have a problem, you support me. If you have a problem, I support you. It's not the typical market exchange kind of mechanism. And new kinds of volunteerism also emerged on a large scale during COVID. So my point is that this is the most recent example of second movement, and this is also what shows us like something like an X-ray, which goes below the skin and shows you what is inside the body, or a CT scan, or an MRI, or an ultrasound. So, as healthcare professionals, as public health activists, society, what we see on the surface appears maybe not very enthusing, but if you look a little deeper, that potential for social solidarity and public action in the expanded sense is very much there, and it's very much alive. Now I'll take a little detour because in the first three sessions, we did not talk at all actually about public health systems. And because that was not the topic. And even today, I will not go into great detail. There's a whole and very major topic on which a whole range of, sessions probably could be conducted by various people. So, but I'll just briefly touch upon what is the direction of change that we need to start very seriously working on in some kind of collective manner. I'm not going to say something very new. Probably many of you are already aware of these ideas. But so the point is that in the corporatized, financialized kind of healthcare ecosystem, public health services and also public-private interactions get shaped in a particular way. And in this entire situation, public health services also can be planned and developed in two different ways. So the one which is essentially the current dominant kind of sort of model is what you can call contained public health services. And these are, so no society in the world can do without a public health system, even the most hardcore capitalist societies. So you need, you even if you want to have a very corporatized healthcare system, you still require public health services. But what is, the role that is then sort of delimited for this kind of a contained health service is basically some levels of care like primary health care, preventive and promotive services. Some sections of the population, basically maybe rural populations and the most poorest sections of the urban population. And so public health services are supposed to remain focused on that. And they don't reshape the ecosystem. They, in fact, get adapted to the corporatized and financialized ecosystem. And the other alternative model, and that is actually the only way or the only direction through which public health services will get rejuvenated in our country, is by talking about universalization-oriented public health systems. Now, that does not mean that the public health system will immediately start giving care to everybody, which is a very, very, it's a very complex and prolonged process would be required. But it at least means that the public health system seeks to organize care for the entire population and for the entire spectrum of healthcare, primary, secondary, tertiary. And so that vision, that horizon of universalization, if it comes onto the agenda, the way in which the public health system starts functioning starts to change. So yeah, this is the kind of model of contained public health system, the current model, and where market-driven private healthcare is, the dominant sort of actor. And then there are these public-private interactions which emerge in this kind of situation. And I'll be arguing that without having an alternative model of public-private interaction, we cannot envision the kind of transformation that is required in India's healthcare system. Now, there can be a debate on this. So many of our friends, and including myself also, have traditionally only talked about strengthening public health systems, and which is, of course, very important. But now in India today, in 2024, we cannot meaningfully talk about strengthening public health systems in isolation unless we also look at what is happening in terms of public-private interactions and what is happening in the private healthcare sector. All three actually need to be viewed in an integrated manner. So anyway, this is the current dominant sort of form of public-private engagement that we are seeing. So all these health insurance schemes, the PMJAY, the state-specific schemes, whether it's Arogyashri or Chief Minister's Insurance Scheme or Mahatma Phule Jan Arogya Yojana in various states, particularly southern states. So they all essentially are this kind of public-private engagement where uh, the public health system and the publicly organized program or scheme, publicly funded scheme, it continues to fuel commercial healthcare in different forms. And the mode of operation of the private sector remains more or less similar, not exactly the same, but similar. And public provision does not expand as a result of these engagements. At the most, there is some minor strengthening. I would even call it strengthening, some additional flow of money to public hospitals, but that may even be a replacement for regular funding. And these schemes are targeted, they have very weak social accountability mechanisms. And overall, they're designed to work for the private sector, for private healthcare providers. And there's some, I mean, some kind of access to care, of course, is there for people who are covered, but it's a whole range of issues which, of course, you all would be aware of. So now, what is the alternative? And even if it takes a significant amount of time to move in that direction, the public health system has to be oriented towards universalization and towards universal healthcare. And then, that reconfigures the way in which not only the public health system functions, but also the way in which the private healthcare sector is viewed, and also the way in which engagement or interaction between the public systems and private providers are configured. So this is a different form, a different kind of perspective, which can emerge and which basically we need to think about. So just to summarize these two different, so you saw my more or less my first slide, which is about, healthcare as a social good versus healthcare as a commodity. So we saw the arrow since the 1950s to the current present day. And so now let us see that how this arrow can be well, not exactly reversed, but the second movement, how it will configure, this in a very different way. So healthcare as commodity today, what we are seeing are these kinds of market-centered engagements, uh, health insurance schemes of various kinds, PPPs, etc. And so there is basically uh, these points I've already mentioned. So some selected procedures are given to some section of the population. Control of admissions is completely in the hands of the private hospital. Many people are denied, or they pay out of their pocket. So there is double charging and whole range of issues, delays, procedural obstacles, etc. are there, and very little social accountability. To reconfigure this and to flip it in the different direction is public-centered engagement, where rates have to be completely transparent, standardized across the board, a free service environment. If you walk into the hospital, everything has to be free, and all the patients there who are being treated actually should be getting free care. Rationalization of treatment practices, control of admissions with the publicly organized system rather than with the private hospital. Comprehensive care. It's not that you'll get this, you won't get that, you will get this, you won't get that, but rather essentially with a few, some exceptions, you more or less get everything that is required in terms of essential healthcare. It's universal and it has some kind of social accountability. And there are several examples across the world of this kind of public-centered engagement. I suppose even Mike can tell us a little bit about NHS, which despite all the problems and commercialization still has, I think, many of these features. So what we have seen until now are essentially the market-centered kind of engagements. Now the reverse arrow needs to be towards basically universal healthcare. That is the direction which we'll need to move in. So how do we do this? And this is, I think, a basic point that if we don't have a strategy, then we are just following, the strategy which is already imposed on us by the dominant system. And therefore, it's very important to have a strategy, even if the situation appears challenging. So the direction is basically socially reclaiming healthcare. We have to move towards developing a system for universal healthcare. This is, I think, something which probably all of us already know about. So I'm not kind of repeating all the details, and we can probably have a separate discussion about it. But just for sake of mutual clarity, this is essentially a kind of system where, and this is incidentally, even hardcore capitalist countries like Thailand or Japan or Scandinavian countries, and even to some extent Canada, UK, Australia, have some version of universal healthcare. And so it's not something which is completely unrealistic that I'm talking about. And these are some of the features: a larger role for the public health system, which is expanded, much higher level of public health expenditure, and eliminating at least profiteering and grossly irrational care, and a fair deal for doctors, healthcare providers, nurses, and a decent livelihood for healthcare professionals. So different parts of the puzzle can be solved only when the entire puzzle is taken together. Otherwise, if we keep looking at only one part, like how to strengthen public health services or how to regulate the private healthcare sector, probably will come up with a sort of um, you know, um, inability to move beyond a certain point, because these are all linked with each other. I'll come to this point very soon. And so we are talking about a free system of universal healthcare, where essentially free healthcare is a kind of a right, and it's a network of expanded, improved public providers and contracted and regulated private providers, a combination of both. In India, obviously, there's no way that we can have this without a significant involvement of private providers. And that is why how we configure the interaction is very important. Elimination of waste, irrational investigations, irrational medicines and procedures, uniform norms, and participatory governance at various levels. And so essentially, UHC it's an umbrella which brings together a whole range of providers with public management and financing. So I'm not going into these details, probably already we know. And as I mentioned, that the Thai healthcare system is probably one of the systems which is quite relevant for thinking about UHC in the Indian context. And of course, we all know that what we are talking about is something, universal healthcare is something very different from what is generally marketed as universal health coverage. So universal health coverage retains the same commercialized, unregulated, irrational practices on in the private healthcare sector. It only channelizes public funds towards them. And while another actor usually enters into the picture in terms of insurance companies, it's essentially a whole range of procedural complexities persist. And these complexities are there because of the unregulated nature of the private healthcare sector. So we're trying to join a public objective with a highly privatized kind of mode of functioning, and it doesn't work basically. So it inevitably fails to actually deliver what it's supposed to deliver. We can discuss about that further. But now I'm coming towards the some of the key sort of concluding slides. In society today, what are the kinds of processes which are incipient or which are the building blocks of the kind of health system change that we are talking about? So I have the six hexagons which you see on the sides are these kind of six interrelated processes, which already in some form, at least there is a demand for it to some extent, or there is a potential for these to be developed. And I'll now come very soon to also who is going to do this. It's not just a good idea that is sufficient. There has to be a social force behind that. But before coming to that, let's see what are the core components of this. So reclaiming, expanding, and upgrading public health systems is obviously very important. Along with that, majorly configuring public-private interactions and even these health insurance schemes. These have to be completely transformed in the direction of UHC. In their existing form, as we know, they are not going to, move very far ahead. Socially regulating private healthcare, which is not just the same as typical bureaucratic regulation, not just implementing a typical CA type of law, although that is important to a certain extent, but it's, as we talked about, interventionist regulation and social accountability, and also involving sections of the medical profession in this kind of process. So it's a different kind of more participatory and socially accountable process. Addressing the whole range of special healthcare needs, women, children, elderly people, socially marginalized groups, Dalits, Adivasis, LGBTQI people, etc., etc., and specific conditions, whether mental illness or so many other, kinds of conditions. So there are actually special interest groups working on many of these areas today. And there are also social organizations, healthcare groups, which are concerned with these different sections. So it's only a UHC system which can actually ensure that their special health needs are adequately satisfied. So this is another important, very important input. Then healthcare workers and professionals themselves, whether it's Ashas and Anganwadi workers or ANMs working at the ground level, or even doctors working in public hospitals, or even for that matter in private hospitals. There's a whole range of healthcare workers and professionals who also have to, need fair employment and working conditions. So that's another important front of activity, which unions take up in their own way to a certain extent. And finally, participatory governance, accountability, and decentralized planning. So these are the six kind of key building blocks for developing a system for universal healthcare in India, and which will probably not happen all at once in the entire country. It's going to be a very complex, contested, and but at the same time, in my view, inevitable process in the next coming 1 decade. So either we will go down the path of expanding health insurance schemes, giving some health insurance to elderly people, as has been recently announced, and then maybe to other sections of the population. But we cannot escape it. It's going to, there's some variety of either universal health coverage or universal health care will emerge in this country in the coming 1 decade. This is almost, inevitable to a certain extent. But of course, um, the kind of model that is developed is going to be critical. And there, these six interrelated projects, which you can call as health sub-projects, need to be brought together. And there are already some level of analysis, some level of understanding, even some level of social action to a certain amount on each of these individually, but They are not integrated, probably under a context of a process for UHC. And there are certain states in India which are probably more, conducive to bringing these processes together. In other states, it will probably take more time, but at least a start needs to be made. And then, where will the social force for this come from? This is very, very important, because no major change in society, no political change, no social change, even no economic change takes place without a strong social force being behind it. And here we need to learn from the the health movement in Brazil, the entire process of development of the Thai UHC system, and the role played by various kinds of social and public health actors, and even other parts of the world. So, fortunately, in India, we do have a range of what I call social health constituencies. So, these are sections of society which have some relationship with the health system, which is important, and which make them potentially important stakeholders, and sort of forces for change, and which need to be woven together and brought together. Now, I'm going to describe 7 or 8 such constituencies, and that doesn't mean that today all of them are equally active, but they are all have some level of activity around healthcare, at least some sections of them. And if these are upscaled and brought together, it can actually form a huge force for health system, reform, moving in the direction of UNC. So, in many parts of the country, we have rural populations which have been engaged with healthcare, panchayat members, women's groups, local social groups, and we have seen a number of experiments like community-based monitoring and planning, or various kinds of social accountability processes, where rural populations have engaged with healthcare. Women's organizations in have been active on women's health issues in various forms, and importantly, LGBTQI persons also face a range of issues related to discrimination and lack of provision of certain important forms of care which they especially require, and they also have a certain stake. Socially marginalized sections, Adivasis particularly, we have experience in states like Maharashtra and probably other places also. They are geographically, socially, culturally, and economically marginalized from the healthcare system. So, so there is a strong potential for groups working in Adivasi areas to engage on health issues, and to a different extent now even Dalits and Muslim communities who face certain kinds of discrimination and marginalization. Frontline healthcare workers, especially ASHAs, other kinds of contractual health workers who are engaged on a large scale in many states as part of NHM, nurses, junior doctors in both public and private sectors. Junior doctors means basically frontline and service doctors, resident doctors. So these are important constituencies who also are right now working in often quite unsatisfactory kind of conditions. Even the violence which has erupted and which continues to erupt, and where the Kolkata incident reminds us of that, and is actually a product of a certain kind of dysfunctionality in the healthcare system. It needs to be viewed in that form. And the justified demands for security by frontline doctors need to be integrated with a larger program for public health system upgradation, improvements, and health system reform, which we can discuss in more detail. Patients groups, and we have seen this in Maharashtra and even in some other places, that individual patients who have suffered huge problems in private hospitals, corporate hospitals, some of them call themselves medical victims. They, have also um, started coming together and demanding, improved sort of conditions in private hospitals. Not-for-profit providers, community health NGOs, genuinely charitable providers and mission hospitals and similar other, they also are right now facing a huge range of issues because of corporatization of healthcare. They're becoming less and less viable, finding it difficult to attract specialist doctors. They may either have to transform themselves into a corporatized entity and give up their mission, or they have to shut down and in a different way, wind up their work, or find it greatly constricted. So each of these is an important constituency where already some kind of initial internal churning has started. That may not be obvious immediately that this is a basis for moving towards UHC, but each of these groups has a role to play in UHC, and each of these groups has a stake and a positive, will positively gain from a UHC system. Medical students, resident doctors, trainees, I just mentioned that. I mean, they are still not integrated into the corporatized, commercialized system. And there is definitely a certain scope for them to envision a different kind of future. And finally, workers on a large scale in semi-organized and unorganized sectors who are actually either covered by ESI or potentially can be covered by ESI. And they have an important stake also in, demanding reorganized and much better access to healthcare. So these are 8 what I call core social health constituencies. And of course, not all of them are active, not all of them are equally, mobilized, but looking at the COVID experience and looking at the fact that each of these has a kind of already existing activity, what we need to do is to bring these together in a meaningful form around the project of UNC. And there need to be intermediate steps which are meaningful to each of these groups. Because people will not just work for a UHC as an abstract concept. So if they're workers, they will first of all want to reclaim ESI or get better services from ESI. If they're rural populations, they want an improvement in their local PHC and their local CHC and local public health services. If they're healthcare workers, they want better, have better wages, better working conditions, etc., rationalization of their, work and so on. So each of them, if they are like not-for-profit providers, they would like to see that their models which they have developed, perhaps of certain kinds of models for, improved delivery of healthcare, to be upskilled. It may be training of health workers, community health workers, it may be some other thing. So each of them has a stake in a genuine UHC system. But today they are not talking to each other. Today there's no platform for them to actually collaborate with each other. So even if a small critical mass within each of these can develop, it can come together and form a huge, significant social force to transform and basically overcome, you know, the commercialization and corporatization of healthcare by putting UHC on the agenda. So the last couple of slides, some of you may have heard about Marcos from Mexico. And this is one of my favorite quotes. To remain hopeful in very depressing and challenging times is itself an important task. Of course, this hope, as I said it right in the beginning, should not be based on some kind of unrealistic or romantic or glorified understanding of reality, which would not help us. It has to be very, very firmly grounded in the real life situation which we face today. But at the same time, as I said, in any society where there is the first movement, there is also the second movement. And that second movement in healthcare, that reclaiming of healthcare by society, that bringing together of the diverse social constituencies in health and taking up those building blocks of health system transformation. This is a project which needs to be now embarked upon by so it's something which would be very widely collaborative, and so many different kinds of people need to start these conversations. It's not going to happen very soon or very immediately, but unless we start these conversations, we will not move ahead. So if we have the hope that this transformation is both possible and necessary, with that realistic hope, we need to move ahead. And as healthcare professionals and intellectuals, I'm calling us intellectuals in the Gramscian sense, people who are supported by society to do intellectual work and who also have the capacity and the leisure and the luxury of being able to look at some of the larger pictures, some of the wider processes and dynamics. We have an important role to play. I'm calling everybody who's there on this call and many others like us, probably tens of thousands or lakhs of such people, even in the health sector in India, um, as healthcare professionals and intellectuals. So the system has become so complex and there are so many layers, so many levels, and so much is concealed or not readily understandable that you need people who will who have the interest and the capacity to unpack this complex multi-level dynamics, which extends, as we know, from the global to the local level. And but this will not just come by reading books or websites, and it's also not enough just to rely on direct experience, which is also very important, of course, but not sufficient. So some combination of both is required for us to aspire to our our role as organic intellectuals of working people. Again, a Gramscian term for those of you who may be familiar with the concept of organic intellectuals. So who are basically healthcare professionals or public health activists who are socially embedded in some form, who are working directly with people in some form or the other, who have a good appreciation of the ground level realities, but who can also understand the big picture and integrate this with the small but very important other pictures at the local level. For certain groups, it may be TB patients, it may be people in a tribal community, it may be urban slums, it may be women's health issues, whatever. So this kind of integration is very much required, and I cannot think of any better group to do it than essentially this, not group, but whatever, this the section of healthcare professionals and intellectuals as far as the healthcare system is concerned. And as healthcare professionals, we often have a unique vantage point. We are both insiders and to some extent outsiders. Um, and we can see what's going on in the hospital, in the health center, in the clinic, in the program. And we can also, understand what larger society, how it's, um, dealing with the situation. And we can bear witness. We can observe, we can analyze, and we can bear witness. So finally, what are some of the possible roles? Now, this is, of course, a big discussion, and provided that we are interested in it, we could have an entire separate session. But I'm just flagging some possible roles. Um, Documentation. What happens in corporate hospitals and large private hospitals today is not adequately publicly documented. It's usually shrouded under in the healthcare establishment. So patients get some idea of it when they receive the hospital bill, or maybe a little bit of idea when they look at the range of medicines or investigations that are supposed to get done and pay for. But obviously they have, it's difficult for them to understand actually the targets, the uh, driving of certain kinds of excessive and irrational care, and the impact of corporatization in a very day-to-day and real sense which is taking place. So we need this kind of documentation. It's urgently required, and which can be done by healthcare professionals. Collating this critical evidence from different sources. So it's not just in one hospital or in one area. It's across the board in different forms. Of course, with diversity, with a lot of diversity, but still bringing together this evidence as insiders, outsiders, and then this grounded analysis linked with that. And through discussions and what I would call socially embedded theory development, we need to develop an agenda for society. We means in a very broad sense, I'm saying, not just this group or just not just one particular group, but we in the broad sense. That kind of socially embedded theory development is something which is urgently required because of the complexity of the situation, because of the challenges in the situation, and because of that, just having a fragmented understanding of some part of the system is important but not sufficient. We need to be strongly linked with particular, specific components of the health system, but we also need to have that integration with the larger entire view. Communication. Whatever we understand, are we able to communicate it with people in a language that ordinary people can understand? Even our peers can understand. So like Gayatri said that she's trying to sort of condense and summarize the main points which were made in the first three sessions. And I really am, quite, I don't envy that her for doing that task, because it's really going to be something really challenging. But yes, we need to do that kind of communication. And it's how many people understand what are the impacts of financialization in the healthcare sector in India today, even within the health sector. Definitely not as many as who need to know about these things. So we have a role of communication and strengthening dialogue across these various diverse constituencies. I mentioned 7 or 8 core social health constituencies, each of which has some relationship with the health system, which enables them to work for change and which already has some incipient processes going on. So having a kind of, like Marcos talked about, a world which contains many worlds. The project of, or the process of developing UHC is a process which contains many important sub-processes. And but they can also come together with a common goal of UHC. And maybe building a critical mass. It can also be in a few states to begin with. It can even be in 1 state or 2 states, um, which has the sufficient bandwidth and capacity to look at the entire healthcare system, and can start developing through dialogue, through, obviously with differences, shades of opinion, different viewpoints, which are very important. But as we move ahead, some things we agree upon, some things we agree to disagree upon, but still we can move ahead with some kind of broad contours. And we can catalyze what Gramsci has called intellectual moral reform. Something very interesting, an interesting term, which on the surface of it sounds a little like something moralistic, but it's not about moralism. It's basically in any society which is facing a crisis or which is facing multiple crises, um, there's a need for a voice or an articulation of what is the problem and what needs to be done in a very coherent and realistic manner. And that is the beginning point of change. And that's what Gramsci called intellectual moral reform. So that intellectual moral, because it's talking for entire society. It's not just a vested interest. It's just not like IMA saying, oh, private doctors need to have, security and their interests need to be protected. So that's not, society doesn't view that in a very positive way. So uh, a socially articulated project and process which takes into account all the different, components of society and all different constituents and places on the agenda uh, a realistic but at the same time visionary program for change, which starts in the real world of today and takes us towards the desirable world of tomorrow. So that is the kind of process which needs to be done. And we will need new concepts. We will need a new framework also to a certain extent, because as Einstein told us, we cannot solve our problems with the same thing we used when we created them.
Thanks, Abhay. There is a question by Santan in the chat. He asks, within this list of core social health constituencies, where do you place the professional managerial class? Are they always antagonistic towards universalization, or are there ways also to make them allies in this struggle? Can such ways happen unless they are resisted and protested against?
Okay, as usual, a complex question from Santan. So, yeah, so the point is that a project of genuine, public-centered universal health care, um, in my opinion, of course, there will be some important lobbies which will resist it. But once it starts appearing as a realistic option and significant sections of society start visibly supporting it, which also means that some section of the political class also starts seriously considering it, the professional managerial class is it can shift. So it's not some, of course it has some interests of its own, but they can find a role for themselves even in the UHC system in an appropriate manner. So my hunch is that some section of the, this, let us say, public health managers, or what we broadly consider as public health experts. So they usually will go with the tide. Today they are with the dominant system, naturally, most of them. But there are people even in public health services who have a certain kind of pride about what they want to do. They feel uncomfortable about some of the things that are happening, especially privatization of public health facilities and so on. But there's no channel for them to, sort of join up with or to, link up with. So, and in the Thai instance, if you see, they have this triangle that moves the mountain. You might have read about it or heard about it. And in that triangle, one of the angles of the triangle is basically healthcare professionals and public health experts. So they are very important for any large-scale health system change. So it has happened realistically even in other countries. If you look at the whole Brazilian health movement in the 1980s and 90s, that also shows us something similar. And there are other examples also. So I think that, but let's start with these 6, 7, 8 core health constituencies. Start thinking about it, working with them, having dialogues with them. In Maharashtra, in a very small way, we have started, at least thinking about it and doing a few things about it through our People's Health Manifesto process and so on. So at least putting these constituencies together, as I said, once it forms a kind of a critical mass, then some sections of the healthcare professionals and even managers will tend to gravitate towards us, or at least start taking us a little more seriously. I think they can be allies in some form.
Who has said if you could go through the last slide again, please, and
The
explain.
last slide, okay.
Not the quote, the one before that.
Yeah.
Not
Okay.
Einstein's quote. Yeah, before
Yeah,
that.
I got it. Just a second. Uh, can you see this?
Yeah, this is it. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going into the full presentation view because then I cannot see what is happening in the chat. So I think there are a few other comments in the chat.
I have the questions I'm reading out.
Indira has put several points in the chat.
I had asked a question saying what is the difference between universal healthcare and health coverage, and Indira had answered that.
Okay.
Yeah, just to clarify, so I'm trying to respond to some of those issues, some of the comments in the chat.
Okay.
I've not put questions to you. I'm trying to respond to
Gayatri.
Knowing more about this idea of universal health care, national health service. Somebody has given a reference to the Soviet I'm not seeing the link, but the whole idea of Zemstovs is very interesting, which has come from Soviet Union, and that medicine not as a trade, but as a public service.
Yeah.
Some of these ideas come from there. Yeah. They would have been there in many places, other places, but this, because I teach health systems, I try to look at all this and. Sorry, carry on, Abhay. Sorry.
Yeah. So no, I think that's a topic actually almost for a separate session. And I did not go into that really because we didn't have the time for that today, and I'm conscious about the time. But yeah, the difference between universal health care, what we are discussing, and the dominant versions of universal health coverage are quite fundamental and distinct. And the crux is whether the private healthcare sector, the form in which it operates, and the way in which the public health system operates, whether both of these undergo significant transformations and their interaction also is significantly changed in a way that leads to a single unified publicly organized and funded system to emerge, or the existing modalities of functioning of the private healthcare sector continue more or less unchanged, just with their fueled with public funds and often also mediated through health insurance, companies, and essentially the way in which the system finally delivers care even to people, it remains very fragmented, and definitely suboptimal in various ways. So if you remember that earlier slide which I had shown, that kind of gives you one angle on the difference between universal health care and universal health coverage. The one about two different modalities. This one.
Right.
So look at the bottom.
Yeah.
But this is a very capsule slide, you see. I mean, this needs to be unpacked a lot. But it's a qualitative difference. It's not just a minor difference. Anand, could you see the slide? Can I?
No, I think you want.
I went through it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So I'll stop sharing now. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Because I cannot see the chat when I'm sharing properly.
Abhay, I have a question.
Huh.
From what I understood, that now we have to look at if we are to address the health system, the healthcare ecosystem, we have to look at the public health system, the private healthcare sector, and the sort of partnership between the two.
Interactions, let us call
Interaction,
it.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Interaction between the two. And in one of your slides, it's also mentioned that we have to try and move the focus away from profiteering as part of healthcare. But if we do that, then won't we immediately eliminate the possibility of the private sector being involved in healthcare at all?
Okay. See, the private healthcare sector in India today faces a very core dilemma. I won't call it a dilemma, but it's a challenge. The challenge is that the prices of their services, which they would like to charge, are unaffordable for the vast majority of the Indian population. So they want their hospital to be full. They would like, to have all their beds occupied. But 80% roughly of people cannot afford most private hospitals. I mean, I'm not talking about very small setups in rural areas and all, but, at least larger private hospitals, even medium-sized private hospitals in urban areas. So there's a gap. So you'll have the paradox of people not getting access to healthcare, poor people, and at the same time, private hospital beds remaining empty, which is because of this contradiction. So therefore, the private healthcare sector, whatever of course, they want to make profits, but they also want their hospital beds to be full. And that's why they want schemes like PMJY. Because PMJY attempts to bridge that gap by saying, okay, the government will pay for the patients, but you'll get the patients and you get the whatever. So even PMJY, with all its faults and problems and huge amount of deficiencies, starts taking a very partial step towards public purchasing of private care. But in the form in which it does that is problematic for a whole range of reasons. So it doesn't manage to achieve either of the two very well. If you see the actual performance of PMJY, so first of all, it's only limited to tertiary care. It doesn't look at outpatient care. It doesn't look at primary health care. It doesn't even look at the full spectrum of secondary care. It doesn't even look at the entire range of tertiary health care. It's only certain procedures. As I said, it's tailor-made for the private providers, not for the patient. So the patient comes in with a stomach ache. The patient doesn't say, I have a cholecystitis which requires endoscopic, cholecystectomy. No, sorry, he's just, uske to पेट में दर्द है. So उसको पेट में दर्द है तो उसको ये नहीं पता है कि वो 100, 1000, 300 whatever procedures क्या है, मेरा procedure उसमें fit होता है कि नहीं होता है, whether I. So there's a complete mismatch actually. And there are a whole range of issues because of which it doesn't actually function in a form that would satisfy the needs of society. Let me put it this way. So it partially caters to the need for the private sector to have some subsidized patients, from which they can make some money and, fill some of their hospital beds, but it's not a optimal arrangement. It doesn't work very well. But we need to learn lessons from whatever is happening there. We cannot ignore it. And we cannot tell people, oh, stop going to that health insurance scheme. That's not going to be socially or politically feasible. So we have to think very carefully about what exactly is the problem there and how exactly it needs to be transcended and overcome through a better model. That's our challenge, one of the challenges. Because the traditional kind of left position is, oh, these all health. I mean, it's just partly justified. If these health insurance schemes are useless, scrap them. और भाई जो गांव में जो व्यक्ति है उसको कुछ तो मिल ही नहीं रहा था, अभी कुछ तो कार्ड लेके वो जाता है या जाती है, उसको they have to pay something out of pocket, they get some half whatever subsidized care. So we have to see how to move beyond that situation. So Anand, you have raised an important point about what does it mean for FEH. I would suggest that, that should be probably, you can have a separate discussion on that, because all the points which I have put down are actually quite practical, in my opinion. It's not something unrealistic or, of course, it's a bit aspirational. It has a broad horizon, and maybe any particular group can say, oh, this is beyond, these things are beyond our capacity, or only ABC can be done and DEFG cannot be done by us, which is fine. So this is just a brainstorming. These are the things which potentially can be done. And Mike has raised his hand.
And definitely provides a framework for us to think about. So
yeah, hopefully. I mean, you can contest some of these points, you can disagree with it, but I mean, at least we start engaging with these practical, I mean, conceptually oriented, but practically sort of grounded suggestions. So I think Mike was saying something, and then Indira.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, thanks, Abhay, for a brilliant analysis of such a complex issue. And it just makes me think that, it reinforces my belief that there's huge scope for solidarity between the medics in India and medics in the UK. I mean, you more than once made reference to the NHS and as being maybe a standard to aim for, but I'm sure it has been and maybe still is even, but we're going in the wrong direction at the moment. I think that's the thing. Even with the new Labour government and West Streeting and all that, we're going in the wrong direction. But I was going to mention the fact that you talked about, you had a bullet point at one point of weaving together the diverse non-market systems, and during the, I mean, this is the fourth of a series of sessions, and there've been many since I was in India in February. I've attended many amazing discussions, and including medical students and medical teachers and so on. But yeah, what I was wanting to say was that weaving together of non-market systems. I mean, I noticed that Praveen is amongst the participants today, and I know that he is involved in a traveling fellowship, and one of the at least one of the sessions that we've had since February, it became very clear that there was quite a lot of unhappiness amongst medical students and their teachers about medical education, and one of the problems, and it's in the UK as well, is that we come out with a mindset which is determined by the experience that we've had at medical school and then as young doctors and in the system as it is now, and this traveling fellowship, my understanding of it is it opens the doors to different ways of doing things, and I just wondered whether whether that's something that could be expanded on a scale big enough to be a counter to the kind of unhappiness that we were hearing from one of the Gayatri will remember probably which session I'm talking about, but where medical students were talking about the unhappiness of the way their focus is on post-grad admission when they're admitted to, for their first degree, and so that the whole focus is kind of distorted from the word go almost. It sounded like that, and they're overwhelmed with having to with their studies and so
And preparing for the basically PG entrance exam.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, I wondered, I mean, I don't know whether Praveen is still with us, but I just, or anybody else that's got any, knowledge about that. I think Anand might be involved in that as well. I'm not sure. Perhaps you are, Babi, I don't know. I'll stop there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Think
if
Indra
Anand
and
is there,
Sai.
I would like to listen to what Anand's got to say. Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Praveen, I think Anand's left the call. He had to leave.
Okay.
Did you hear what I said, Praveen? Did you hear?
Yes. Yeah. I was listening. Um, Yeah, so Mike, just to add a bit to that, so we did have some discussions about should we make this large scale, like get more people involved in this fellowship so that more doctors can apply. Because in the last few years, starting from about 5 applications 4 years ago, this year we reached about 85 applications, all from doctors who wanting to do a fellowship like this. And then we realized that most of them have no idea what they were getting into. Many people thought it was another thing to add to your CV and did not think of all the challenges that one would go through while doing the traveling fellowship. And also that when we think of doing this in a large scale, it gets kind of diluted because I feel like mentorship has been like the key thing of this entire process. And when we make it, like a large classroom, it just loses its complete essence, if I may. And that's why we realize that a program of this sort can never be replicated in a medical college, and it has to be outside the confines of a medical college. Yeah.
But do you think it has relevance to the topic today of having developing a new or a different perspective or re-embedding? I mean, Abe's been talking a lot about re-embedding in the social, in society. I mean, the title of the talk today, I've written it down somewhere, how we can society can reclaim healthcare. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that from what I've understood about what this traveling fellowship is about, I think it's about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, even I agree that so the aim is not to ensure that rural hospitals have enough doctors, either during the fellowship or in the long run, but rather that there should be socially conscious doctors out there. And whether they go back to government service, whether they join whatever sort of services that they want, there is no any sort of commitment that they have to come back to a rural area by the end of it. No expectation of any sort. Just that there should be people who are ready to see people as people and not as just patients, and who've seen their homes, seen their villages, seen all the hardships that they go through. And after that, what decision anyone takes is up to them. But just that, I think we are in dire need of socially conscious doctors in all areas in healthcare.
I think that really what is really good, that speaks to me about the travel fellowship is that they get to see health and not just the biomedical perspective of what they usually see within a medical college or a hospital. And it's one of the good things is that they don't need to practice clinical medicine in whichever center they want to travel to. They can travel to rights-based organizations or education-based organizations and or other such organizations and play different roles, which is essentially converting more of a doctor into a social biologist, maybe. I think, Indira, would you like to say? I think your hand has been raised for quite a bit.
Thanks. Thanks, Gayatri. Yeah. So, yeah, actually, to complement what most recently Praveen said now and earlier Mike raised, somebody asked about the role of professionals, role of intellectuals being an organic intellectual. So in a sense, I'm kind of complementing all that and speaking to all that only, right? Um, I will take just about 5 minutes. I know we are at the end of this, but again, I want to raise this so that you can, maybe this again needs discussion. Abhay has brought in quite a lot, but for individual doctors, then what does it mean, right? This, how do you produce socially conscious doctors in the kind of an ecosystem that we have been discussing about in the past 3-4 sessions, right? It's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge because some of the studies that we did, of which Abhay was also a part, there are a lot of young doctors out there who are for this kind of corporatization. You see, who are completely, if I may use the word, disgusted with public hospitals, totally put off with public hospitals, right? And we conducted studies, witness seminars where very senior doctors, my age, Abhay's age, very senior and older doctors who had worked for a very long time in public hospitals in Bombay quit and joined the corporate hospitals. That is the reality that one is up against, right? So that is, I mean, this is just to emphasize the challenge that one is up against when one talks of producing socially conscious doctors. You all would be seeing it much, much more. I'm not a medical doctor, so you would be facing it much, much more, and the monumental challenge that one is up against. A lot of doctors are for this kind of corporatization. Why is it so? One needs to understand. It is not just money, it is not just technology and the glamour, but there is a group of doctors out there who wants to actually work for the patients, and who then feel that they want to use the gaps and the opportunities in the system, through charitable trust, through charitable care, through insurance, if they can provide care to the patients, their basic calling. So that we have all these kinds of doctors, not all of them are there for the money. And these I'm quoting from the interviews that we had, right? And from the witness seminars that we conducted. I could share all that, but we really don't want to bombard you and drown you in information, considering that you won't have time to go through all that. How do we distill it and share it with you all is the challenge that I find. Now is so and coming to reforming medical education, yes, definitely. There's undoubtedly no doubt, no two views about it. So quickly, does this whole discussion around medical ethics, does it offer an entry point? What kind of opportunities that does that offer is one thing that comes to mind. Again, because of the time constraint, I'm keeping it short. We can have a larger discussion later on, right? One is because there is this discussion of what is called microethics and macroethics, right? Microethics as to what is, I mean, is the, what does an individual doctor do, what kind of ethical practice, rational practice will they have in their, in dealing with individual patients, right? That is at one level, the micro level, as it is conceptualized at as. But there is also this whole issue of macro ethics, where how do we get doctors to then think about what I call looking beyond this individual professional patient relationship, look at the non-clinical aspects of medical ethics, right? And how things like the entire social context which has been talked about earlier, and this whole where is corporatization coming from, understanding all that, you know uh, um, and how are then how are public health systems themselves organized, right? What about the collective social responsibility of the profession itself? So, how do we incorporate issues about the physician's social and political responsibilities? So, can we then also talk about public health ethics and how exactly the healthcare system is organized? That also concerns doctors, right? That also should concern doctors. How do we bring that into whatever, into even these discussions, and then take it to the larger community of doctors and use that to reform medical education itself? So enlarging the scope of ethics itself, it is not the burden of the individual doctor himself or herself to practice ethically. What are the limits imposed by this kind of a corporatized system on individual ethics? How do you all negotiate your ethical dilemmas in corporate hospitals? I don't know. So these are some of the things which doctors have to start maybe discussing about, talking about, and writing about. Many more doctors. Doctors like Abhay Shukla, Arun Gadre, Sanjay Nagral, a few Amar Jesani, maybe they all have initiated it, but a lot more need to do it, right? And so I mean, these are some things that I just wanted to flag. And then, pushing this then, to questioning this whole thing of doctors should not get into politics, doctors should not be political. I mean, what is the meaning of when, Rudolf Virchow and a whole lot of others said medicine is a social science, medicine itself is political? What do these things mean? So, now the education completely is to become a doctor entrepreneur, right? Where is the scope then to even understand what social medicine and what is meant when we say that medicine is a social science, when Virchow wrote those lines, right? The last point quickly again, what why this whole distinction between medicine and public health? Medicine and public health have to go together. I think even preventive medicine doesn't bring in public health in its entirety. In the way we all understand public health, those of us who are not medical professionals, the way we understand, the way we impart teaching in public health with its much larger concerns beyond just clinical medicine or just hospitals, right? So public health and medicine as two sides of the same coin, they're not separate, right? How do we bring in all this? And so starting with ethics, are there possibilities? Then we talk about different kinds of role models. These are some of the issues that I just wish to flag in practical terms, right? But again, so I'll just stop here and yeah.
Thanks, Indira. Definitely, all of these things that you've spoken about are the key to maybe transforming how we teach and learn about medicine, but I want to say health. This is the reason we came together for the workshops, and it has become quite clear to most of us who are part of this group, or even I'm sure are part of this call, that politics is extremely personal and it is inextricably linked with health. And our view of medicine as we know it right now needs to be broadened. Yeah, maybe ethics is one entry point in educating young medical aspirants. But right now we are at a position where medical colleges don't really focus on ethics at all. There are few that talk about ethics within the curriculum. There are many interesting points that have been brought up, and I think there is scope for much more dialogue about what we can do as concrete steps and both the individual and the macro level. I think that that may warrant a separate and maybe a more interactive, more question answer form of discussion, which I think I can plan with Abhay and Indira soon. But I think all of us, it's already 8:21, so if everybody's okay with it, I'd like to wrap up the call. And thank you everybody for attending.
Just one more. Can I just make one more point?
Sure.
One of the big hot issues in the UK over the last year or two has been the issue about physician associates. I don't know whether Abhay knows about physician associates in the UK and the NHS, There are already 2,000 of them in practice already. And the plans were to massively expand them and really to replace doctors with them. Now, they're people who've got a degree in something that might have some, broad connection with medicine, but not medicine. And their training is 2 years. So there's been a huge backlash amongst the medical profession against them. It's being put on pause. One of the things that I wondered about is whether the ones that are already employed and any further ones that are to be employed, could their role be, when we talk about that 90% of ill health is societal in origin, but because we're all, most of us are specialized in some aspect of medicine, and I know there's Abbe is a public health doctor and Michael Marmot's a public health doctor, but there isn't really an easy route, it seems to me, to kind of sort out what what the structural violence is within the individual patient population that are coming to the doctor's surgery, and highlighting it and getting the various political government departments at every level focusing. Could they have a role, become part of a kind of wider public health view of medicine that does take in the the whole this massive, well, that most ill health is societal, that takes that into account, and in some way I've got only just a vague idea. I'd be interested to hear whether Abbe thinks it's a crazy notion or whether could there be a role for these people in that
Mike,
sort of...
Mike, sorry, I have to leave now.
Okay,
So
okay.
I don't think we have
What
time
could you
right
think
now.
about
Yeah.
that?
Let's I think now the series of presentations is like kind of done from my end. So the next discussion on this track should be in a participatory mode. It should be more like a panel discussion or something like that. And maybe that last 2 slides of mine, those can be sort of a little bit of a starting point.
Yeah.
So what are the priorities for action? What are the options for action? What are the already things which are going on, like this traveling fellowship, which is a very interesting, actually, kind of experiment. So maybe it's kind of, and there are 100 things which can be done, but there are 10 things that we can do actually in practice. So even that is a sort of a little bit of focusing. I think it'll be good to plan the next session that way. So
Sure.
thanks everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.
Thanks.
Okay.
Good night,
Bye.
all.
Okay.
Yeah.